Hey everybody, welcome to Human Factors in Aviation and welcome to the first video of our semester here. This is Introduction to Human Factors and Human Factors in Aviation and Intro to HFACs and the Human Factors models. So first, here's kind of we already talked about introduction to the course. We did some of this in the orientation video. This is what we cover in for the next few weeks, and then we dive into some chapters in the PHAC and the AMT handbook and the AIH. So when we get there, they'll be linked in Canvas. You'll see exactly what chapters to read. So in this course, we're going to basically go over why planes crash. Okay, so let's break that down, and we learn about hazard and risk in the next few chapters. And we talk about memory and how that causes problems for us and the limitations to our memory. Aeromedical factors. We spend 2 whole weeks talking about that. It's one chapter in the PHAC, the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. And this the physiology behind how we crash airplanes, why we're not very good at flying them without a whole lot of practice and tools and instruments, right? Later in the semester, we'll talk about communication, examples that caused accidents, what we can do to communicate better, how autopilot use has caused accidents, how we can use it better, how maintenance mistakes have caused accidents, how we can do those better. But then, bring us back around, we'll talk about how not to crash, that as in how to manage risk, how to learn and use our memory better, how to make better decisions in the air, how to use crew and single pilot resource management. To help build this along the way, we're going to cover accident case studies in just about every module as we go. Every module is going to have either a discussion in the video or a discussion board or some kind of assignment that has to do with a commercial aviation accident. So you can learn a little bit more each week about them. So as we keep talking about crew resource, human factors, okay, so in this FAA advisory circular, these are publications that help kind of explain rules and regulations or just information for pilots. They define human factors in this one particular publication as the multidisciplinary field of human factors is devoted to optimizing human performance and reducing human error. It incorporates methods and principles of behavioral and social sciences, engineering, and physiology, and everything else you can read there with me too. And if you want, you can pause it. I'm just going to dive into a few things. It's making humans perform better and reducing the things that we do wrong. And it has a lot of different fields included in human factors. It's behavioral sciences, social sciences, engineering, physiology, ergonomics, decision making, so many different parts of everything that we do is under the umbrella of human factors in aviation here. A few more definitions. Okay, it's the variables that influence individual performance and crew performance. It's recognized that inadequate operator training leads to system performance degradation. We're talking about overall systems here. We're not talking about one person causing a plane to crash. We're talking about the air traffic controller, the manufacturer, the operator, the pilot, and the air crew all leading to an accident happening. So it's very rarely one person's thing. It's a failure in the system when any accident happens. It's not the failure of one person, it's the failure of the system. That's also in that definition we were just reading there. Some other definitions we'll get on these. It's multidisciplinary, okay, because it has a lot of different fields. It's again, we already talked about those, and it is the applied science that studies people working together in concert with machines. And this really comes together in the shell model we'll talk about in a few minutes too. Might be asking yourself, why am I here? Well, probably because you need the degree and you need this class to get the degree. But why do you really care? Well, first I want to let you know I'm not trying to scare you away from ever flying again. We're going to talk about a lot of things that went wrong in the air, and the point is we learn from each one of those accidents we talk about. So you are not a headline in my class in the future. So that's not my goal, is to scare you away from flying. Okay, so just think of that going in. That's not my goal. Our main goal here is to prevent accidents, really to prevent accidents that happen from happening again is really what we're looking for here. And then of course, as you get better at this, you project that in the future, and you can prevent an accident from ever occurring. But it's just harder to show that. It's harder to show that you prevented something from happening because it never happened for you to demonstrate that it didn't happen. So we're going to identify physiological and psychological factors that impact performance. So not just in aviation. So in whatever you do, you ride motorcycles, you skydive, you scuba dive, you work in an office. Okay, so we're going to help give you some tools that you can use there too. Assess how your lifestyle decisions affect decision making, job performance, personal and professional growth. and apply risk management concepts to every flight. And again, I'm going to be more generic and say to every time you decide to ride a motorcycle or drive a car on the bad weather or the nights or after a drink at the bar with friends. And we're going to have an assignment here later on about developing your personal limitations, your own personal go, no-go criteria. Let's get into a little bit of the human factors here then, not just what it is. Here is one, if you're watching this, thank you. One of the answers to this week's quiz is this. I ask you, who says the great aim of education is not knowledge but action? And the answer will be Herbert Spencer. And so why are we here? Well, we're not just here to learn. We're here to act better, to perform safer, to be more efficient when we get out there, to save lives and prevent accidents from happening. That's why I like that quote there. Let's talk about a brief history of human factors. Well, back in World War One, it goes farther back than that, but human factors in aviation doesn't go much farther back than World War One. So, really, back then when they selected pilots, they thought it was just individual skills and abilities. They were looking for people who were technically proficient because they had to operate this aircraft. They did some intelligence tests because they needed to be smart, but they also needed to be kind of stupid because they needed to be kind of fearless too. They're going up in this flying machine that hasn't really been tested, and they tend to crash a lot. One of their criteria for deciding who pilots were horseback riding skills, because they learned how to manipulate something else to get it to go where they wanted it to. And it's crazy today to think of choosing a pilot by, oh, can you ride a horse? Here, you can come ride an airplane too. But really, for like 20 years, that's what guided pilot selection in the Army Air Corps for a long time, were those criteria right there. Now, this was from a 1941 U.S. Army Technical Manual. And they talked about the shortcomings of some of the training that there was, had their need for pilots and who they were hiring. Okay, out of every 100 aviators killed while flying, 2 met their death at the hands of the enemy, 8 died due to mechanical or structural failure of the aircraft, and 90 perished as a result of their own individual deficiencies. It's pretty sad that 90% of the pilots killed came down to of their own individual deficiencies. A couple things I want to focus on here. 2 got killed by the enemy. 98 died from basically us failing them. So 98 out of 100 pilots that died during this time died because of a failure of the system. They weren't trained right, the aircraft weren't produced right, they weren't mechanically sound, or they didn't perform well enough. Again, probably because they weren't trained right. So we need to get ahead of this, right? So that's just, you can't keep going that way. One of the ways that we did this was by making a simulator. Now, Edwin Albert Link, so something on this page is going to be on your week's quiz too, so I want to make sure you know that's coming. In 1929, the Link simulator is patented. Well, hold on, how do we go from 1941 to 1929? You'll see. Because Edwin Link made the first trainer, patented in 1929, tried to sell it to the Army Air Corps. This is because it was before it was the Air Force, it was the Army Air Corps. And they turned it down, so Link sold it as an arcade game. It was bought and used by another entity. It happened to be Japan. They bought a whole bunch of them, and they were training their pilots how to fly in these Link trainers. And then in about a 78 span, the Army Air Corps lost 12 pilots just because of bad weather, because they didn't have the instrument flying proficiency. So, yeah, and they went ahead and bought some Link trainers in 1934. But now here's what I want to get to, is over 10,000 of these Link trainers were made during World War II. And they call them blue boxes because they look like little blue boxes, right, when they're sat in them like that. This is a way for them to put the hood down, have nothing but to fly on the instruments, and they learn how to just fly this thing inside this rudimentary box. Now, think of where we are today with our flight simulators in the lab right next to the lecture classroom at Miramar College. We've come a long ways, but anyway. So something on this page is going to be, I think I ask you who bought the first simulator, which would be Japan, right? So you're welcome. Those keep going throughout this video, so why don't you go ahead and keep watching the video. So let's talk about in World War II. So human factors became more broadly defined. They started talking about the more crew, because you had larger aircraft with larger crews, as opposed to just the pilot and the machine. They started studying flight crew management because we had to have now a pilot and a co-pilot and a navigator and a bombardier and a waist gunner and a right waist gunner and a tail gunner and a belly gunner and a turret gunner. And they all had to start working together in concert. With this came group dynamics. and how to work together better. That's a good plug for our AVIA 128 Group Dynamics class, which is offered in the fall. It's not offered in the spring, and it's a good sister class to Human Factors because you come out of that class working better together in crew in high risk environments. I started studying stress and how people cope with it. And then finally, the Army Air Corps began redesigning cockpit controls. In other words, they finally started designing the machine to fit the human, making adjustable seats as opposed to finding the right size pilot to fit into one standard cockpit. And really, though, they were still focused on the individual pilot as the only real explanation for accidents that did not involve mechanical failure. So if a plane crashed and it wasn't from mechanical failure, they just said it was the pilot's fault. It wasn't the system's fault. It wasn't training's fault. The automatic thing was, oh, the pilot went and killed themselves today, so it was all their fault. Now let's get into after war. Let's get into commercial accident, commercial aviation. Here in 1952, there's a guideline in this major airline. It categorically stated that the first officer should not correct errors made by the captain. So in 1952, there had to be a captain and a first officer in the cockpit of an airline with paying passengers behind them. And if the first officer caught something the captain did wrong, they were not supposed to say it or fix it or bring it up at all. And that led to a lot of accidents. And this came out in here your 1993 article there. Here are some of the accidents that occurred after that, before we started encouraging first officers. And I could say some of these are only in the 70s, folks. And these are a lot of severe accidents that occurred. This is the air carrier, this is the type of aircraft, this is the location, and how many people died on board that aircraft. And this gets pretty crazy. It was the jet age. All right, we started making bigger jets every day, more airplanes flying. We couldn't train pilots fast enough. We're building aircraft faster than we could safely design and manufacture them. And there's a lot of really bad accidents happen. I mean, look at this. Just in 77, the worst aviation accident to date occurred where two fully loaded 747s connected on the runway at Tenerife. 583 people died on that one. And then just months later, you had another 747 lost with 213 people. You had right here in sunny San Diego, a Pacific Southwest Airlines Boeing 727 collided with a 172 doing some instrument training right over North Park in they're just southeast of downtown San Diego, or east of downtown San Diego. 144 people died both in the air and on the ground in that one. We had a DC-8 run out of fuel on its way into Portland because they were troubleshooting a landing gear indication, and 10 people died. But hey, you know what? There was no post-crash fire on that one because they ran out of fuel before they crashed, right? And then this one was a maintenance failure. They basically an engine ripped off an airplane during takeoff, and come to find out they were using a forklift against procedure, wrong to change engines on this airplane, and they damaged the engine mount. So right during takeoff, the left engine mount ripped off the lower part of the wing, took out some of the flight controls, and the aircraft lost control and crashed. 271 people died on that one. So in the 70s, it was not a good time to go flying. There was a lot of things that went wrong with a lot of airplanes. So we got better, right? I mean, we're getting there. So the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. If you don't know about that, you'll learn all about that in our 105 class. What that did was that kind of took the government step back and stopped regulating commercial aviation. And the government basically said, okay, airlines and airline manufacturers and airplane manufacturers, it's up to you to set your own routes, build your own airplanes, buy your own airplanes, set your own ticket prices. And that's what we mean by deregulation. So after 78, they had to start actually, not crashing airplanes because people would buy tickets on another airline. They actually had to compete for routes, and they had to compete for ticket prices. Now, over the time, that drove down ticket prices, which had an impact on safety, but again, on the end, if you keep crashing airplanes, people are going to fly another airline. So even though money was the bottom line, it still worked out for us safely in the end. Problem is, they still called it pilot error. If a plane would crash, they'd call it pilot error. We don't call it pilot error nowadays. We call it human factors, because it wasn't just the pilot making an error. And what is an error or a mistake or a lapse in judgment? All those are encompassed under human factors. But they did start to finally take human factors seriously when they realized that in this accident specifically, the flight engineer kept telling the captain they were about to run out of fuel. And when they ran out of fuel, the captain was so surprised that he had to say, "Why are the engines all quitting?" Even though he'd been told for the last 30 minutes they were about to run out of gas. So they started incorporating the pilots, the engineers, and academic specialists, people from all over the field. Okay, they started bringing in psychologists and flight simulators and doctors for physiological factors, and they started making a human factors thing. Really quick, ergonomics is different from human factors. Ergonomics is how you keep the body safe while it does its actions and the repetitive actions. Human factors is something else. So I just kind of want to say they're two different things, but they do work together in concert. So we started going from who can we blame for this accident to how can we prevent it from happening again. We went from what happened to why did it happen? Because if you figure out why it happened, you learn the steps that you can do to prevent it from happening again. So we started looking for, were they intentional acts, were they mistakes, were they slips, were they errors, and each one of those actually means something different we'll get into in this course. So let's jump ahead a little bit, and we still had some pretty severe accidents happen. A lot of these we'll talk about later in the semester. In 1985, Japan Airlines Boeing 747, the tail blew off of it in flight as it was climbing out and pressurizing, and they lost control of the aircraft. It crashed into the mountains, and aboard this single airplane, 520 people died, and there were actually some survivors. There were a lot of survivors after the plane hit the mountains, but unfortunately they didn't make it through the night until rescue could come get them the next day. Purely mechanical factor here. It was 10 years before the crash. A bulkhead was repaired on the airplane improperly, and then 10 years later it failed on a different crew, different flight, different people. That's a great example of a latent factor, something that was there for a long time and then eventually it manifested later on in the future. We started having some Boeing 737s had some crashes. Okay, so we had it was a bad time for 737s. There's a couple crashes, and it had to do with the new manufacturer system. It's a valve that runs the rudder, and it's fixed now. Don't get me wrong. Okay, so unfortunately, it took a couple accidents for us to use the investigation process to figure out what was going wrong to cause them. They almost gave up on this one until an engineer kind of went for the fourth time through a box of stuff and retested a solenoid that ran the rudder and figured out what was going wrong. So accident investigation is a huge part of why we're so safe today. If an airplane crashes, we don't spare any expense to figure out why it crashed so we can keep it from happening again. This was improperly loaded cargo. There was a fire in a cargo hold in a ValueJet DC-9, and uh, the oxygen generators caught on fire, and they caught the tires that were stored improperly next to them on fire in a cargo compartment, and they weren't able to extinguish the fire because of that type of construction the aircraft was, and killed a bunch of passengers on it. So again, it's just my point here is it wasn't any one thing that went wrong. It was stuff that was loaded properly in the airplane, and then no limited detection and no extinguishing ability in that compartment that was in there. In 1998, a Swissair MD-11, there was a fire in the cabin overhead. It got started by the in-flight entertainment system, the IFEN system, and because of limitations of the aircraft, the cockpit crew didn't know there was a fire. They started smelling smoke, but they weren't really sure. There was no fire indication. They followed the checklist procedures, and one of the checklist procedures was turning off a recirculation fan, and it turns out that was the only thing keeping the fire out of the cockpit. So as soon as they did that, it was kind of all over after that. I'm talking about the links in this chain here. Okay, so there was no way to detect a fire in the cabin overhead. A fire was started in the cabin overhead. I'm counting on my fingers here. There was not supposed to be flammable material up there, but there was, and they had no way to extinguish the fire when it was up there. So, and then ultimately they still had control of the airplane, but then once they lost all power to the cockpit, they had no way to fly with the flight controls anymore. So, it's a lot of things go wrong in these. Okay. Right after 9/11, an airplane crashed in Queens. They thought it was another terrorist attack. Turns out it was really, at the time, most pilots were being trained improperly what maneuvering speed was. And this accident really let us all realize, hey, what maneuvering speed actually is and what we could do about it. And again, it was the accident investigation that helped us out there to figure that out. Let's get a lot more recent. most of you haven't heard about any of the other accidents I just talked about, but this one maybe you have. And a Boeing 777 crashed and going into San Francisco in 2013. 3 people were killed, and it was a beautiful, clear day. And there was just a couple crew deficiencies that caused this crash. They hit the seawall short of the runway, ripped the tail off, made it on the runway. A couple people got killed during the crash, and then one person got ran over like 2 or 3 times by the firefighters when they were coming to save everybody else. So we'll talk about that one too. But then I want you to notice the numbers continually going down overall after that. The we go more and more years between accidents, and when there are accidents, there's fewer of them that occur. So we're trending in the right direction. Accidents happen less and less frequently, and when they do happen, usually less and less people perish on them. All the way down to, I'm going to say this is kind of what we're looking for here, right? So this United Airlines Boeing 777 took off out of Denver, Colorado. This is just in 2021. And shortly after takeoff, basically as they went through about 10,000 feet, the right engine had an uncontained failure. There's usually a lot more to it, okay? And when this engine exploded and it shook so violently, it shot all the engine cowlings and the front ring off and went all over the place, all over Denver. I'm going to skip forward a little bit of this one so you can kind of see the size of this uh, engine ring in the front yard. And you saw some in-flight video of the fire. They're interviewing some passengers. They come back and they land, and then everybody gets to get on YouTube and interview about it. That's what you want to happen. If things go wrong, very rarely do things go wrong, but when they do, you train for it, you plan for it, you practice for it, and then nothing bad happens from it. All right, people miss their connections, I'm sure, but hey, the pilot and the crew got the aircraft back okay, and that is all because of the construction, the design, the training, and the skills of everybody involved in that one. So if you made it this far in the video, you get the secret answer for this week's quiz. It's Dauphine. Go ahead and write that down because this is worth a lot of points on this week's quiz. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw in little random questions like this throughout my videos, and you'll see these questions on the quiz later on. And you only get 30 minutes to do the quiz, and my videos are more than 30 minutes long, so you're probably going to have to watch my videos before you do the quiz to get good grades on them. So let's get into the different HFACS analysis here. Let's start out with why again, and some of the statistics behind this. Approximately 80% of aviation accidents are caused by human factors. So we used to call it pilot error because that's immediately visible. Pilot makes a mistake, plane crashes. It's pretty easy to see that the pilot did something wrong, so they call it pilot error. And it's often, though, the last of a chain of events. It's usually a few things started going wrong, and then the pilot did the last thing wrong before the plane crashed. We talked a little bit about maintenance error, like the Boeing 747 that had the rear bulkhead improperly repaired. Most maintenance errors are latent. You don't see them. They might not happen right away. They might happen years later. Uh, and it's less obvious, but just as disastrous, okay? And they're both called human factors. So again, we don't call it pilot error anymore. We call it human factors. Now we talk about the HFACS, the classification systems we have for statistically keeping track of accidents. We are going to talk about the HFACS, that's the Human Factors Analysis and Classification System. And then we're going to talk about some other models that precursed that led up to that. The Shell model was the original in the 90s, James Reed's and Swiss cheese model, and then we're going to end with Chappell and Wigman's HFACS. There's a quick reference for this one. If you want to go skybrary.aero, you can search for that and search for HFACS, or watch the video. But if there's something in my video that you want to learn more about, this is where I get some of the information from right there. Let's start out with Elwyn Edwards' Shell model. In 1972, he came up with it. And it's a very simple building block diagram and a basic aid to understanding human factors. A lot of times you see it just the SHEL, and then sometimes you'll see it with 2 L's, sometimes not. And I'll talk about why, but when I talk about the Shell model, it's going to have to include all 5 letters, okay? So the S here stands for software. By software, we mean rules, procedures, written documents, SOPs. I don't mean like computer software. Remember, this was made in the 70s. There wasn't a whole lot of that around back then. But we mean like not physical hard things, like things with words. Words are software, like standard operating procedures and documents and procedures. Hardware is the stuff you touch. That's the layout inside the cockpit, the configuration of the controls themselves, the displays that you look at and use, things like that. Hardware, things you can touch, things that are tangible. And then the environment includes not only the physical environment, but the economic environment, the social environment. And this is where the software, the hardware, and the liveware all function is inside the environment. Now, liveware, I put a star next to it. There is two of them, so it's worth talking about. Liveware, that's the living things, the human beings, the air traffic controllers, the flight crews, the flight engineers, the aircraft mechanics, management in the company, everybody else is involved. The reason there's two L's here is because liveware, people have to learn the software to operate the hardware in the environment, but then we have to deal with other people too. That's why it's laid out the way that it is. Now, the liveware is the most critical part of the system. Okay, even drones don't fly without some kind of human input. Right up until Skynet becomes active, that's how it's going to be. We're the most flexible component in the system because we can learn new jobs, we can change things on the go. We are the most predictable component, mainly that you can predict that we're eventually going to do something wrong, because we are the most susceptible component to internal changes, feeling, pride, sorrow, sadness, hunger, motivation, and external changes like temperature. All right, if it gets too bright or too dark, we can't see things. If it gets too loud, we get headaches and can't think. If we get overloaded with work, we shut down. We can't handle it all, and all those items. So we're an important part of the system, but there's a lot of things that we do wrong too. Like dealing with other people. That's the liveware interface. And that's not just dealing with other pilots, it's dealing with flight crew, it's dealing with leadership, it's dealing with management, it's working together. It is, but also limited by differences in personality, or you may not get along with somebody, but you still got a job to do. And that's where the SOPs and training comes into play. It includes programs like crew resource management. That's CRM. We'll talk about that later on. Team resource management, which is really what AVI 128 focuses on that we've already talked about. And threat and resource management and single pilot resource management. We deal with software because through laws, rules, regulations, orders, standard operating procedures, and yes, those computer-based programs. Now, in more modern cockpits, you do more software work than you do physical hard flying work because the airplane does a lot more functions. We don't have the flight engineer in any modern aircraft because the airplane itself is the third crew member, the flight engineer. Of course, we deal with the hardware because that's the machine we're sitting in, or the displays we're looking at, or the controls that we're touching and moving, and ergonomics and how comfortable it is to do it, and how well it is to reach what we're doing, and prevent those soft tissue injuries from repeated movements and stuff like that. Of course, we work in the environment. The physical environment, or where we're at, is it too hot, too cold? Is it raining? Is it cold? Is it snowy? Is it too dry or too wet? Organizational environment, and that includes rules and regulations, the company that you're with, and much of the liveware environment research and development has only been concerned with how to protect the people, how to protect us from radiation and fuel spills and carcinogens and noise and light. I mean, for good reason. If you kill your pilots off from radiation and things like that, then you're going to be a harder time getting replacement pilots, right? So that was the shell model from the 70s. And let's jump forward into the 90s here. We got the James Reason Swiss cheese model of accident causation. And basically, he came out with not just how things work together, but he started looking at the accidents themselves and how accidents are the result of an individual's mistake in combination with other failings in the system. So again, we start to see the word system there. This is a system that failed. So here's one of many renditions of James Reason's Swiss cheese model. You have at least 4 levels of protection here, and a hole in a level is a weakness, and the only time an accident would occur is if it manages to make it through all 4 levels. More on that in just a second here. So it focuses on system, not just one thing that goes wrong, but what all had to go wrong for an accident to occur. I'm going to show you many more renditions of this as we go, okay? So it focuses on the system versus the individual once again. Not so much who done it or who's to blame, but what went wrong, what will go wrong next time, and what can we do to keep that from happening. So you see holes are from failures in the system, and a slice of cheese is a layer of defense or a barrier or a safeguard. And this is probably the last one I'm going to look into because it's the most detailed. So we see 4 levels of failure that have to occur, and the organization gives protection, the supervisor gives a layer of protection, and then setting things up. These are the preconditions, the situations there had to be a weakness there for an accident to happen, and then still there has to be an unsafe act or an act of failure. The last thing that went wrong. This is usually what the pilot does. Is this is the pilot error that was focused on for decades. So most accidents can be traced to a failure in each level. So it wasn't any one thing that went wrong. And that's why we research accidents, so we can figure out what went wrong in our 4 levels. And so these 4 levels, you'll see again in the HFACs, the organizational influences. So we'll get into them in the next model here. And unsafe supervision, preconditions for unsafe acts themselves. Now, in our first few chapters of our risk management handbook, we'll learn the difference between latent failures and active failures. Just really quick though, it is latent failures were there before the accident happened, and active failures were like the final straw that broke the camel's back, the last link in the accident chain. The last thing that went wrong that either caused or allowed that accident to happen would be an active failure. And usually it goes in this order most of the time. So the slices of cheese were a defense against failure. The holes are a weakness in the system. So they're continuously changing, they're always moving around. The system only fails when holes in all the slices align. Now, if you get a block of Swiss cheese right now, you can't see through it. There's holes all over it, but you can't see through it. But then if you cut them into slices and move them around, eventually there's going to be a hole that goes all the way through that whole block of cheese. That's what's happening here. We call that a trajectory of accident opportunity. If all those holes align, there's a chance for an accident to slip through all of them and cause an accident. And you got to remember that if you stop that accident at any one level of those defenses, there wouldn't have been an accident. It never would have happened. So I said we'll talk about it later. We'll mention it now again. Okay, so latent failures contribute indirectly to the accident. They're not the direct cause, but the direct cause wouldn't have happened if it weren't for a latent failure. They're usually there before the activity starts, and they're the links leading up to the accident. That's why we call it the accident chain. Which is why you see so many graphics here, so many FAA presentations and talks about breaking the chain. So if you break the chain anywhere along the way, the accident never would have happened. So I like this because it goes from all the way from upper management to what a mechanic could have done wrong to what a mechanic did wrong to what the crew also did wrong. There was an accident. If anywhere along that chain you stop it, there would be no accident to occur. Those active failures are the direct cause of the accident. Again, I'm getting a little bit into your first risk management handbook chapters here, but it's worth it. They usually happen during the activity. This is usually the last thing that we focus on. This is what the media loves to look at. It's only the final link of the accident chain, though. It's not, the whole, all these latent factor links led up to it, and usually this is the last thing that happened. I saw this on a door going into the maintenance hangar of a Marine squadron, and that you only know what this is if you've learned about the Swiss cheese model, and I like it. It's the Navy's right on board with the James Reason Swiss cheese model. If you see these holes lining up, you know what to do. You got to stop. You got to say something. You know that an accident's about to happen. Now here we are introduced to the HFACs, a little bit more complex next stage, right? This is Chappell and Wigman's HFACs that came in later in the game. So that's why we're ending with it. Now, you'll see the same four levels that James Reason had on his, and the first three are latent factors. They're the same, actually: organizational influences, unsafe supervisions, preconditions for unsafe acts, and then the unsafe acts themselves. But you see, the HFACS breaks it down into subcategories inside there. A little bit about this: Dr. Chappelle, Dr. Wegman, 1996, they came out with this. The idea is to investigate and analyze human factors accidents. It closely resembles Reason's model, and the same facets still apply, that human error had to occur at each of the four levels and at least one failure in each level. And if you corrected any failure, then there wouldn't have been a mishap. So they did this to assist in investigations, so they could, again, not find out who to blame, but to see what they could do to prevent it from happening again. And the reason they had so many subcategories was it was for uh, record keeping, so they could make statistics of it and they could try to figure out, so they could take it to the command or the Air Force or whoever their customer was and say, well, these are the problems that are causing your accidents. A higher percentage of accidents are caused by this. This is what you need to work on. So of course we want to prevent accidents from happening, or prevent old accidents from happening again, or prevent anything like that from happening again. And we keep beating this horse for a reason. The goal of all this is not to attribute blame, it's to prevent accidents from occurring. So again, these HVACs, it's all about the system. The system failed if an accident occurred, not just one thing went wrong. So we can use it proactively, as in before an accident happens, to see recurring trends to stop an accident from happening. And so in the end, we're reducing accident rates, we're reducing injury rates, and really what we're doing is we're saving money. So this is how you sell it to your customer. I mean, if we can investigate accidents, we can figure out what's going wrong, prevent accidents, and that's going to save you money in the end. So it was first used in the Navy. That's where it was started. Okay, and then it spread to industries, and here we are in civilian education talking about it now. But other transportation and even non-transportation industries. So let's go through each of the four levels. I'm not going to beat them all into detail, but we need to talk a little bit more about them so we have an understanding. If you notice, this is in your syllabus, like a picture of this and of Reason's Swiss cheese model. This comes up again and again throughout this course. When an accident occurs, when we do an accident case study or an accident investigation, we're going to figure out which one of the four levels failed. And it's kind of important you understand which one, because if you just think, oh, here's four things that caused that accident, they might have all been in the unsafe acts, and you didn't go the next step in your accident investigation to figure out the preconditions and the supervision and the organizational influences. So we're going to talk about each one. So first, let's talk about down here on our unsafe acts. It's broken into errors and violations. So an error is an unintentional behavior. It wasn't meant to happen. And the subcategories there are skill-based errors, like that you didn't prioritize correctly, you didn't pay attention to the right thing, you made a checklist error, you have bad habits that you were following. Those are also called norms. Decision errors. It exceeded your ability to make good decisions. You chose the wrong procedure to do it the wrong time. Or perceptual error, like you didn't have the inputs you needed. You had impaired vision. Oxygen was impairing your vision or decision making, or you had an instrument failure and you were flying using a bad instrument, for instance. So these are as pilot error-ish as you can get, right? These are the things that we think of when we think of pilot error, and it's halfway there. It's in the name. Well, that's different from a violation. So when an error is an unintentional act, a violation is an intentional, willful disregard for rules and regulations. It goes in a routine, like things you'd normally do all the time. Like here in SoCal, it's pretty routine for people to be going above the speed limit on the highway. It's habitual action. It's actually tolerated by authority. So going 5 miles over the speed limit is generally tolerated unless they have another reason to pull you over. The exceptional violation would be doing 30 over the speed limit, and that is an isolated departure from authority, and it's not condoned by management. The cops won't let you get away with that, right? So those are two driving examples of what we're talking about there with violations. That's pretty straightforward. It's also kind of the smallest one of them all. There's a lot of preconditions for unsafe acts. Let's talk about, first of all, the three main subcategories: environmental factors, And I think you can get the hint there. It's the physical environment you're in or the technological environment, like the ATC suite. The condition of the operators, that's who's doing it. It's not what they do, it's the condition of the operator before they make the error or the violation. Do they have an adverse mental state, like are they thinking the wrong thing, or they're worried about losing their job or a divorce or something else? Adverse physiological state, that would be they're hungry, thirsty, dehydrated, they have a health condition, or physical or mental limitations. We all have mental limitations. We'll talk about that in a future module, but can they can't pull hard enough on the control they need to pull on, or they can't process information fast enough because they have something else going on. Or personnel factors, and this is broken down into crew resource management, how well people work together with each other, or personnel factors, as in they weren't ready, they weren't rested, which could also be physiological, but they weren't trained or prepared for that operation that they were doing. See how I did there? Environmental, we talked about the physical, and we talked about the technological, and how they all work out. And if you need to, you can of course pause it and read through it. I've already talked about them all. Condition of operators, adverse mental state. Again, we talked about stress and mental fatigue. Physiological, that's the body's needs. Are they sick, physically fatigued? Hypoxia causes degradation in memory and decision making and vision. Again, we'll talk about that in our physiological factors. And mental limitations. Do they lack the physical ability to do what they need to do, or the mental capability to comprehend what needs to be done? And then personnel factors, we talked about planning people to work together and then them being ready. This will come up later on, especially when we talked about like the Colgan Air crash later on. When you're supposed to be resting, you need to be resting, not on your phone texting or traveling. And that's why we have crew rest rules and very tight alcohol restrictions and so forth. And so then we get into unsafe supervision here. So starting at the end here, the active factor. This is what think of the pilot did wrong at the end. What allowed that to happen would be the bad condition of the operator, or the environmental factor, or the personnel factor. And let's go up one more level on top of that, unsafe supervision. As in the supervisor, probably not the pilot, but maybe the person who signed off the pilot or trained the pilot, or the simulator check airman that signed off the pilot on the last check or something like that. Inadequate supervision, as in they didn't do their job as a supervisor. They planned inappropriate operations, as in, let's say when I do a flight review with a pilot, I pick things that either the pilot normally doesn't do because they never practice it anymore, like stalls and power off landings and stuff like that. Because most people that own their own airplane don't do that to their own airplane. So if I went out and did a flight review for somebody who always flies from here to Temecula for lunch, and we flew from here to Temecula for lunch and didn't practice any maneuvers along the way, or do any diversion or instrument out procedures or emergency procedures, then that'd be on me if I signed them off and then something wouldn't happen on that, if you ask me. Failed to correct problem, knowing something was wrong and signing them off anyway. Or supervisor violation, and again, a violation is routine or exceptional. It's a willful disregard for the rules, and if the supervisor illegally does things wrong, signs off the pilot, for instance, then that sets the whole chain in motion. We'll see how I do here. Okay, inadequate supervision. We need to give them what they need to succeed, and plan an appropriate action. Another example there would be what's okay sometimes is not okay other times. I think my good example of this one would be when you're in combat, some things are okay when, as opposed to being back here in garrison or back in non-combat operations. Exceeding crew day in combat, you do what you got to do, but back here in civilian operations, it's what's at risk. So. And then we talked about failure to know correct problem and violations. Okay, failure to know correct problem, knowing something's wrong and letting it to keep going, and not doing your job, not wanting to turn somebody in, not wanting to get somebody in trouble. And then, of course, the supervisor willfully disregarding rules and making violations. Brings us all the way to the top here. with organizational influences. Organization, this is company. This is top down right here. This is why it's the top of our organizational chart here of our HVACs. So at the very top where all the money comes from, if they don't give you the tools, the money you need to do your job, it's just going to cause problems all the way down the line. The organizational climate, if it's hateful, hurtful, if it's not a fun place to work, not a safe place to work, then that attitude and those influences are going to trickle down as well too. And then let's see what my notes say about organizational processes here. So basically, yeah, so it's all organization level decision making. If you don't give people the money to, if you don't give people money and benefits and a reason to stay, they're not going to stay, and then you won't have good people working in the company, and you're always going to be hiring new people that maybe lacking the experience. And the organizational climate, as in the policies, the culture is a big one right there. We'll talk a little bit about cultural psychology later in this class too. Oh, and the process is everyday activities. Is how much do they micromanage you or let you work on your own, or do they give you help when help is needed? Those kind of examples there. So that is really kind of a toe dip into the HVACs. Of course, if you want more information on all this information and where it came from, it's that skybrary.arrow link, and I'll try to put that down in the notes down below. So to tie up our HVACs part of our video here, all these human factors analysis and classification system, or each one of these three different models that we talked about, they help us conceptualize, visualize, and categorize how accidents occur, so we can figure out how the human error was a part of it. And just to say it again, another way of saying latent factors are the accident just waiting to happen, and the active factor is the cause of the accident. The way NTSB, or National Transportation Safety Board, accident reports are written up, they'll have probable cause, as in what probably caused the accident, the most important cause to it, and then factors contributing to the accident include. That's all the things that led up to that accident happening. We'll see a few examples of those in this class as well. So we're going to, in this class, we're going to try to help develop strategies to reduce human causes of accidents before, during, and after training. So next we're going to talk about risk management. We're going to talk about the process of weighing risk versus reward. So to get you ready for that, I would like to go ahead and read Risk Management Handbook, chapters 1 and 2, I think, but let's go to Canvas and see for sure.